Chapter 2. Radical Chic and the Rise of a Politics of Therapy. One of the main rationales for the notion that integration demanded a differential or racialized code of behavior came from the tenets of the therapeutic culture, which pervaded American life at the same time that the civil rights movement achieved its landmark legislation in the mid-1960s. This turned out to be a fateful coinciding of events. The premium on individual identity, emotional satisfaction and expression, and an immediate superficial sense of well-being were the staples of the therapeutic sensibility that increasingly held Americans in thrall. Although openly disdainful of much of mainstream culture, the militant turn taken by 1960s dissent ironically helped pave the way for a triumph of a politics of therapy. Black Power and Honky Baiting. In his essay Civil Rights Blues, the cultural critic Stanley Crouch conveyed his impression of a conference he attended in Jackson, Mississippi, marking the 15th anniversary of Freedom Summer. Largely because of the participation of Southerners, he wrote, the conference countered the pompously disillusioned and narcissistic constipation of the political scene at the time. Crouch noted a certain seriousness of purpose among the Southerners, who differed from many of the shills of Northern radical movements, who seem almost always to be seeking some form of therapy, if not the romance of anarchy. Crouch found two things disconcerting about the Jackson Conference: the chasm that seemed to exist between the conference hosted by Tougaloo College and the surrounding black community, and the angry debate over the issue of whites in the civil rights movement. The community felt ambivalent about, and even betrayed by, the outcome of the civil rights movement, since it had given the people the political rights but not economic means to participate fully in American life. Meanwhile, the conference participants reviewed what had become a major issue of contention in the mid-1960s, in the twilight of the nonviolent movement: interracial organizing. When the white civil rights lawyer Allard Lowenstein stood to speak, one woman, who was white herself, whispered to the black man sitting next to her, "Why is he speaking? All he knows about the movement is that he tried to destroy it." Crouch reflected on the moment when such sentiments first came to the fore, arguing that the expulsion of whites from the movement and the breaking of alliances with other groups was, quote, the beginning of the end for most reasonable politics in the black community. He faulted black nationalists for adopting the swagger and style of the hero of Hollywood westerns who resorted to violence to accomplish his ends. This posturing was irrelevant to the Southern civil rights movement, which Crouch thought really was revolutionary, except insofar as it sapped its spirit. The Black Power movement's intense preoccupation with the place of whites, as it shifted its base of operations from the South to the North, indicated how it had lost touch with those it claimed to represent as well as its allies. In Crouch's view, this shift was one of the greatest tragedies of African American history. Crouch's piece, perhaps because of its necessarily abbreviated length as a newspaper column, explained this tragedy primarily as a loss of valuable alliances. The breakdown of interracialism in the civil rights movement certainly brought serious tactical problems, but interracialism had its own difficulties, particularly in the realm of ideology. The historians Harold Cruse and Christopher Lasch, at the time, suggested that the inability of white New Leftists to develop an original political analysis based on American conditions debilitated the black movement, laying the groundwork for a turn to mere therapy as a replacement for real change. Cruse wrote that the Afro-American nationalists cannot come to terms with themselves as American products, created out of American conditions and ingredients, requiring in the final analysis an American solution. Lasch's essay, Black Power, Cultural Nationalism as Politics, observed that, while the Black Power movement's great promise was its suggestion that the creation of distinctive collectivist institutions could lay the grounding for political and economic power and for moral rehabilitation, it faltered primarily in failing to free itself of the worst features of the New Left: its self-destructiveness, its romantic anarchism, its preference for rhetoric and gesture over practical politics, its distrust of the older generation, its sense of powerlessness and despair, and its lack of political analysis. What analysis it offered, based on a simplified version of imported revolutionary ideology, did not apply to the situation of black Americans. Lasch thought that Marxism, for instance, at least in the way that the New Left drew on it, did not directly address the American experience, since blacks were not in the same situation then as white workers, but instead constituted a marginal lower class by virtue of being largely shut out of the labor market. The left, he thought, threatened to divert the black movement's emphasis away from collective self-help to a non-existent class-based movement for radical social change, which was a misplaced dream, not a practical plan. Crouch alluded to this importation of white leftists' influence when he criticized the limited political vision of black nationalists or thugs shaped into transparent Marxists. The rise of the therapeutic. Crouch's lament made a vital connection between the movement's increasing preoccupation with itself, particularly with the question of white participation, and its growing distance from the people it claimed to represent. In 1970, referring to the black movement, the political philosopher Michael Walzer addressed this distance in his analysis of the obligations of activists, given the claim they commonly make, to speak or act on behalf of oppressed men and women. Regardless of whether they belong to the group they seek to help, their obligations are threefold. Activists must pay attention to and be guided by the consciousness of the oppressed, even if they hope to change that consciousness. They must not despise concrete improvements in the condition of the oppressed, even if such improvements make their own work harder, and they must act so as to open up or keep open the possibilities of democratic action. Like a number of other social critics at the time, Walter argued that the shift to revolutionary rhetoric in the Black movement marked a betrayal of this ethical code. In fact, unlike the earlier movement, the new militancy failed to capture the imagination of the huge numbers of poor blacks who had courageously supported the civil rights movement, suggesting that it was indeed cut off from the consciousness of the oppressed. While it offered a brief glimmer of hope for an alternative both to the economic and social impoverishment of the Black ghetto and to limited conceptions of integrationism, hope for a fresh mixture of both traditional patterns of community strength and new intentions for full citizenship, Black Power's increasing focus on the issue of white participation signaled a growing preoccupation in the country with identity as an end in itself, and with a particularly therapeutic rendering of identity at that. Crouch alluded to the Northern radicals' search for some form of therapy. Lasch called Black nationalism a radical cultural therapy for the ghetto. Cruz criticized the back-to-Africa mood of many Black nationalists as a romance of the mind and a balm for the psyche, which has a bolstering effect on Black self-esteem. In The Triumph of the Therapeutic, the sociologist Philip Reif argued that a long-term cultural shift had changed the entire basis of modern society and personality as the therapeutic sensibility replaced religion as the dominant way of understanding the world. Faith and revelation had given way to analysis and psychotherapy as the windows to truth about the human condition, eroding any sense of moral authority external to the individual. Reif cast traditional culture as the inheritance of permissions and restraints, which were expressed and understood in ideals and distinctions between right actions and wrong. The repression of certain impulses for the sake of communal living constituted sublimation, in Freud's term, but this self-sacrifice on the part of individuals translated into cultural activity, directing the self outward toward those communal purposes in which alone the self can be realized and satisfied. Faith involves in part the internalization of moral authority that takes place as children are socialized, helping to constitute an authority over their behavior from which they cannot detach themselves except at the terrible cost of guilt. Reif thought the emergent therapeutic culture was an anti-culture based on an ethic of release, which fostered individualism and preoccupation with the self. Falling by the wayside was the earlier belief that communal commitments provided salvation from the unbridled self, and that culture provided relief from the pressure of impulses by limiting them to fixed wants and disciplining their expression. Whereas the religious worldview erected creedal hedges around impulses of independence or autonomy from communal purpose, the therapeutic one removed all such boundaries. By Reif's logic, the new focus on a manipulatable sense of well-being as an end in itself not only atomized individuals but also foreclosed fulfillment of the profound human need for meaning and common purpose. Reif held that the early civil rights movement had the potential to challenge the emergent psychological perspective that seemed to be overtaking all realms of social life. Not only did the civil rights movement promise to change the status and conditions of life for blacks, but it had the potential to renew the entire moral demand system in the white American culture. Because society itself had changed irrevocably, however, Reif speculated that it was more likely that, instead of changing culture itself, blacks would adapt to the mainstream order. And because the religious and therapeutic frameworks of understanding were so completely at odds, he thought that this adaptation was probably necessary. The religious origins of the civil rights movement would need to be shed in order for blacks to be integrated into the new secular order. Quote, "The national good demands that they be educated up to the post-religious level of the whites as quickly as possible, if further civil disorder is to be avoided." Reif saw the new direction taken by the movement in the mid-1960s as likely to help seal the triumph of the new therapeutic sensibility. Indeed, the portion of the Black Power movement that concentrated on image and identity shifted the locus of activity from the nation to the individual, sidestepping the most critical arena, the community. The therapeutic notion of identity called for unlimited self-expression as a goal, instead of a collective rehabilitation aimed at the formation of a morally viable community. Like Reif, the sociologist Richard Sennett pointed to the rise of an ideology of intimacy that came to govern social life. The personalizing of relations in public betokened a growing inability to distinguish between the public and the private realms, and to value each for its distinctive character and demands. A meaningful public realm, with its impersonal manners, conventions, and ritual gestures, was increasingly edged out by the new self-absorption of what the literary critic Lionel Trilling called the boundaryless self. Drawing on Trilling, Sennett stressed the vital point that while a new premium was placed on individual authenticity, or the direct exposure to another of a person's own attempts to feel, the actual content and import of that expression was compromised. Quote, "The more a person concentrates on feeling genuinely rather than on the objective content of what is felt, the more subjectivity becomes an end in itself, the less expressive he can be." Sennett, like Reif, thought that greater psychic absorption was directly linked to lessened social participation, since the more individuals laid bare their entire emotional interior under the aegis of authenticity, the more they lost the habits of sociability and the code of civility that underpins social relations in public and allowed them to express their public selves in a measured and meaningful way. In the meantime, not only did intimate life get more shallow, as it was conceived increasingly in terms of fleeting emotional or psychological states, but social relations themselves, invested with misguided expectations, became more isolated, atomized, and fratricidal. This elaboration of the problems with the seemingly benign notion of individual authenticity helps us make sense of aspects of the rhetoric about race in the 1960s by placing them in the context of the broader culture. The therapeutic approach to the world clearly clashed with the religious and moral grounding of the early civil rights movement. In a letter to a friend in 1968, Virginia Durr, a Southerner engaged in interracial organizing since the 1930s, mentioned that some of her fellow activists believed that the movement's new emphasis on black identity as the basis for worldwide revolution and as a mandate for violence was psychological. It rested on the idea that blacks had to be encouraged to let out their hatred and bitterness as sort of a catharsis before they could be cleansed. A month later, she wrote, "I do get so angry and really frightened of these northern white radicals or liberals who say hatred is a good catharsis. Let the blacks beat the whites over the head for a change. And while they don't actually say they approve of sniping, they don't seem to condemn it. I think they are using the Negro movement as their own catharsis and letting the Negroes bear the brunt of the brutality, and it makes me mad as hell." Durr's reference to the manipulation of blacks by whites for their own psychic relief eerily echoed the accusations that the Freedom Summer Voting Rights Project of 4 years earlier had recruited northern white students for the sake of media attention, disregarding the dangers they would face. Both displayed an instrumentalism that was foreign to the doctrine of individual dignity, self-worth, and mutual respect at the core of the movement. That the stakes were so high, at times involving imprisonment, beatings, and even death, made the later reorientation of the movement toward separatism that much more tragic. People like Durr considered it remarkable that many white radicals supported black militants, even when the militants asserted that they viewed all whites as enemies. This was a particularly disheartening phenomenon to some of those who had fought for a generation, often at great peril, against white supremacy, racial hatred, anti-Semitism, and enforced segregation. Payback time. It was only in the context of the rising black identity movement that the issue of white participation in the black movement could gain such salience. A ritual of exclusion became commonplace as a kind of payback for blacks' exclusion from the white world during years of discrimination. Perhaps the most dramatic incident concerning white participation in the changing civil rights movement was the decision of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, the organization mainly of college student activists founded in 1960 to battle segregation and discrimination, with tactics like sit-ins and voter registration drives, to take a vote on whether whites should be expelled from the organization. At a retreat at a New York estate on December 1, 1966, tensions over the role of whites came to a head. After hours of debate, a vote was taken at 2 a.m, long after many workers had given up on resolving the issue and gone to bed. The final vote was 19 in favor, 18 opposed, 24 abstentions, including the handful of whites remaining by then, with about 40 other staff members not taking part in the vote. Ironically, most whites had already left the organization of their own accord. The civil rights movement's shift in focus from the rural South to northern ghettos, and from nonviolent direct action to community organizing, were given as reasons why whites were no longer needed to work among blacks. In addition, as Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton argued in their treatise Black Power, many came to believe that leadership of the black movement should naturally go only to blacks. Many whites accepted these terms and followed the suggestion that they fight racism in white communities or otherwise provide support but not actively participate in or lead the movement. Certainly, for some of the younger, militant new black activists, the exclusion of whites from the movement was a way of aggressively asserting black identity, asserting control over what it meant to be black. Ironically, some black activists declared that the most damaging case against whites in the movement was that they sought blackness as a kind of therapy, and yet many black advocates of identity assertion as a political end in itself, a vaguely defined task at best, increasingly used therapeutic terms. Some of their critics within the black movement feared an overly personal and psychological interpretation of black power. Martin Luther King Jr., Bayard Rustin, and many NAACP leaders, for instance, thought this emphasis on identity directly threatened social and economic goals. For those who considered themselves to be the vanguard of revolutionary struggle, the stress on identity both allowed for and called for proof of authenticity. Belonging to the middle class or refusing to adopt the new revolutionary rhetoric could cause black activists to fail the test of having a genuine black identity. Cruz wrote, "There is a purification process going on constantly within nationalist ranks, each faction vying with each other over standards of purity, blackness, and anti-whiteness or pro-African traditionalism. Of course, disqualification worked most easily in the case of whites, for race alone was sufficient evidence of inadequacy for the task of revolutionizing the black condition." One contemporary sociological study sought to capture the psychological process by which whites allegedly came to understand that they were unfit for membership in the changing black struggle. In particular, it accused whites of possessing ulterior motives for wanting to participate in the civil rights movement. The Harvard University sociologist Charles J. Levy's Voluntary Servitude, Whites and the Negro Movement, published in 1968, was based on his experiences as a member of a civil rights organization and as an instructor in a nearly all-black college in the South. In it, he described the psychological stages through which he thought white participants in the movement progressed. Although quirky, the study helps show just how far afield of the earlier movement's focus on full citizenship and community building the discussion had run. It also illustrates the extent to which the search for identity and feeling good about individual identity through a sort of social release or therapy had become a preoccupation. At the outset, Levy characterized his book as an attempt to understand what happens when members of a dominant group seek membership in a dominated group, when, in addition, the admission requirements set by the dominated group are at least as insurmountable as those imposed on its members for entrance into the dominant group. Levy meant that blacks, given their historical treatment by whites, refused to trust white activists, for trust, wrote Levy, is perhaps the one thing that members of a dominated group can withhold. To Levy, all interactions between blacks and whites were predicated on the mistrust all blacks harbored for all whites. He thought that whites yearned desperately for the trust of blacks, and that whites entering the civil rights movement sought a sense of belonging and even forgiveness, which they soon realized was unattainable. Levy laid out a scheme of 4 emotional stages over the course of which whites encountered blacks' deep reservoir of suspicion: contentment, indignation, awkwardness, and dismay. According to Levy, after becoming involved in a civil rights group, whites were protected by a variety of shields that prohibited them from grasping the full extent of blacks' mistrust. Temporary involvement in the movement, for instance, and the initial formality of social relations kept interracial interactions on a superficial level, so that whites tended to mistake deference for trust and friendship. As whites and blacks began to associate more closely, however, numerous new misunderstandings developed. The deep psychological need on the part of whites to be trusted and accepted by blacks rendered them abjectly dependent upon blacks. These activists, or movement whites, as many called them at the time, trusted blacks without reserve and assumed the feeling was mutual. Thinking they had found acceptance and identity, certain white people rejected their old identity in order to search for one with more meaning. They found the answer in passing as a Negro. As the civil rights movement became widely publicized and popular in the early 1960s, particularly among youth, and shifted from a lost to a won cause, it drew many people who felt disenchanted with the dominant culture. Their alienation now provides a sense of belonging, Levy wrote, and a seamless bond with the Negro, expressed through a trust relationship, still appears to the white as the most convincing proof of alienation. In order to forge this seamless bond, whites rejected their own past and sought a new identity in blackness. The rejection of the white world is used by the white as a basis for acceptance. He offers it to the Negro in himself as certification of his disengagement from whiteness, Levy argued. In the less analytical terms of one white civil rights worker, a lot of people are in the movement because they're alienated from white society, and black is what's happening, and they want to identify with black. The white community is what they're running from. There's no sex appeal. As blacks in the movement felt more at ease around white participants, and as time eroded some of mutual reserve, however, whites reacted with indignation when they suddenly experienced a partial recognition of the mistrust and a total recognition of its legitimacy. They believed that such mistrust must be misguided when directed at their own case. They merely needed to prove that their own contribution to the movement was heartfelt. Entering a phase characterized mainly by awkwardness, whites subsequently searched for an exemption from whiteness by overworking, deferring to blacks on all matters, or focusing on the sources of their own alienation from mainstream bourgeois America. Interracial sex, according to Levy, could be the epitome of exemption seeking. Some white women thought that making themselves sexually available to Negroes would earn them acceptance, but instead found themselves rejected by black women. Levy also suggested that whites who tried hardest to work through these interracial dynamics, those most committed to the movement, ended up becoming the target for blacks' accumulated anger toward racist whites. Levy argued that attempts to gain exemptions from black mistrust only backfired, breeding further suspicion, since blacks simultaneously needed to justify their own mistrust of whites by seeking evidence everywhere, especially in the motives and behavior of those whites most willing to take risks for the movement. At this point, whites realized they lacked the basic requirements for membership in the in-group, but rather than rebelling, they acceded to blacks' right of self-determination, and found that they could not even disagree with blacks' judgments of them as whites. They could not defend themselves without becoming defensive. The motive for white involvement in civil rights then became a central preoccupation on both sides. A typical dialogue, according to Levy, proceeded as follows. A black worker asked a white worker why he or she was in the movement and received this answer: "I'm certainly not in it to help the Negro, because I'm not paternalistic. I'm in it to help me." Rather than dismissing charges of paternalism, this answer confirmed preconceptions about white self-interest, desires for self-advancement, or beliefs in self-divinity. And in fact, whites next turned on themselves and found their own motives unsatisfactory. They faced a demolition of fantasies, as they realized that a true trust relationship with blacks was impossible. During this last stage of dismay, whites felt shocked, rejected, and lost, and thus disengaged themselves from civil rights activism altogether. They decided that they had been undermining the movement. Criticism of the white liberal. Whether or not Levy's perceptions applied to most activists, they do capture the growing obsession with the role of whites and the employment of terms of racial identity to explain both white and black behavior in the movement. Levy's interpretation of the interracial tensions in the civil rights movement as grounded in psychological drives was part of a larger set of criticisms of white liberal behavior and attitudes. In the 1960s, liberals increasingly came under attack, as in Lauren Miller's Farewell to Liberals, A Negro View, published in The Nation in 1962. Miller expressed frustration with the willingness of liberals to compromise with customs and traditions that prevented blacks from achieving equality. What is interesting is that much of the earlier criticism faulted white liberals for failing to treat blacks exactly the way they treated other whites, for failing to fulfill the imperatives of early civil rights universalism in both daily interactions and public life. The journalist Louis Lomax, defending white participation in the civil rights movement, discussed how whites could damage the black cause by becoming knee-jerk liberals, who ostensibly held liberal views but failed to put them into action in their own lives. They, quote, become blinded by their liberality and thus find it impossible to say something critical about an individual who happens to be a Negro, when indeed something critical needs to be said. In Delusions of the White Liberal, the sociologist Kenneth Clark attacked liberals' tendency to try to dissolve the, quote, deep feelings of guilt about Negroes by exaggerated warmth, sentimentality, and condescension. Because of the history of white oppression of blacks, whites wrongly sought a return to a psychological state of original innocence. Quote, no one should expect purity of himself or others. Any genuine relationship between Negro and white must face honestly all of the ambivalence both feel for each other. Each must identify with the other without sentiment. The white must resist the tendency to attribute all virtue to the underdog. He must respond insofar as he is able with a pure kind of empathy that is raceless, that accepts and understands the frailties and anxieties and weaknesses that all men share, the common predicament of mankind. End quote. Clark and Lomax pierced through the disingenuous behavior of many liberals, exposing a kind of rhetoric of authenticity that feebly paralleled that of some black militants. Clark's embrace of a pure kind of empathy, while attacking precisely the search for purity, revealed how shaky the foundation for this criticism could be. His phrasing, genuine, honestly, without sentiment, hinted at the possibility of relationships free of complexity and outside of history. He simultaneously argued compellingly that the ability to tolerate nuance, ambivalence, and weakness needed to be a part of any universalistic approach. His view was symptomatic of a political climate at a crossroads between civics and therapeutics. Fixated on purity or authority, even critics of liberal condescension or overcompensation seemed unable at the time to get beyond them completely. Politics were becoming personal, and few seemed able to stop that from happening. In 1967, the journalist Andrew Kopkind wrote in the New Republic, "What galls SNCC people most is the way white radicals seem to have treated SNCC as a kind of psychotherapy, as a way to work out problems of alienation and boredom and personal inadequacy." Some critics saw student activists as driven by other psychological instincts, such as those unleashed in adolescent rebellion against their parents, and argued that whites in general, and not just liberals, were suspect. Still others directly confronted these charges, marshaling statistics and interviews on activists' backgrounds to prove that their motivations were not personal. In Core and the Strategy of Nonviolence, published in 1968, Inga Powell-Bell argued that the idea that white activists turned to the movement as a rebellion against their parents was not borne out by her research into their motivations. And the sociologist Alfonso Pinckney, in The Committed, White Activists in the Civil Rights Movement, offered the common defense that a vast difference existed between the white liberal and radical. Citing the definition of the genuine liberal in The Authoritarian Personality by T.W. Adorno and others as someone with moral outrage, individuality, and the vigor of identification with the underdog, Pinckney wrote that the white civil rights radical was free of racial prejudice towards Negroes. Unlike that of liberals, their commitment is total and genuine. Sometimes, although not always, their identification is so complete that they think of themselves as Negroes. Writing in 1968, Pinckney insisted that whites were welcome as ever in the civil rights movement, as long as they agreed to take supporting roles and organize white communities against racism. He dismissed the accusation that white activists were acting out their inner psychic needs stemming from early childhood as rooted in the American tendency to eye those who seek to speed up the process of change with suspicion. This debate over white motivations for civil rights activism illustrates the extent to which race had become tied to the psychological rehabilitation of blacks and whites alike, and to the attendant waning of a sense that racial justice was a public matter of importance to every citizen. Norman Mailer's famously controversial essay, The White Negro, published in 1957, had pointed to what he considered the psychological needs behind many whites' interest in immersing themselves in the world of blacks. In his essay, subtitled Superficial Reflections on the Hipster, Mailer portrayed the hipster as a psychopath who sees blacks as a model, since they have lived on the margin between totalitarianism and democracy for 2 centuries. Because of the constant threat of violence, Mailer believed, a black man could rarely afford the sophisticated inhibitions of civilization, and so he kept for his survival the art of the primitive. He lived in the enormous present, he subsisted for his Saturday night kicks, relinquishing the pleasures of the mind for the more obligatory pleasures of the body. In Mailer's account, blacks' supposed lack of inhibitions appealed to the white rebel. Giving expression to the buried infant in himself, he can lessen the tension of those infantile desires and so free himself to remake a bit of his nervous system. Like the neurotic, he is looking for the opportunity to grow up a second time, but the psychopath knows instinctively that to express a forbidden impulse actively is far more beneficial to him than merely to confess the desire in the safety of a doctor's room. Mailer continued this description of the hipster as a sort of self-analyst. He exists for those charged situations where his senses are so alive that he can be aware actively, as the analysand is aware passively, of what his habits are and how he can change them. The requisite therapy entailed the divorce of man from his values, the liberation of the self from the superego of society. Blacks supposedly held the key to this self-administered therapeutic, since psychopathy is most prevalent with the Negro, because of the self-hatred caused by prejudice. In response to racism, blacks developed the language and behavior of the hipster, a whole code of life in which truth is no more nor less than what one feels at each instant in the perpetual climax of the present. The high point in life was to swing, for to swing is to communicate, is to convey the rhythms of one's own being to a lover, a friend, or an audience, and, equally necessary, be able to feel the rhythms of their response. The Image War. Some of the white activists interviewed by Charles Levy echoed Mailer's cliched idealization of blacks' libidinal freedom, as well as his idea that association with blacks could fulfill a need for psychological release. A white in the movement notes that Negroes have the healthiest life in the world, whereas white minds are always cracking up, the hospitals are full of them. You can't get along very long without love, without your body, Freud says. A white who was once deeply involved in the movement continues to see the world in terms of white is rigidity, Negro is freedom, Levy wrote. These whites were obviously not alone in connecting blacks with hypersexuality. Eldridge Cleaver argued that the myth of exaggerated black masculinity perpetuated racism by legitimizing white fear and repression of the supposedly unrestrained instincts of blacks through segregation, institutionalization, and policing. Black men themselves, Cleaver thought, helped perpetuate the stereotype of hypermasculinity and prowess out of the very real need to establish an identity in the dehumanizing context of the violent and racially stratified American city. The myth of hypermasculinity encouraged black men to live up to their image, as conveyed by the wider culture, in order to reject the arbitrary authority of whites. By embracing this imposed definition of their very identity, however, black men participated in their own subjugation. In Cleaver's view, their show of machismo through violence ended up buttressing the portrait drawn under slavery by white slaveholders of blacks as uncivilized and unthinking brutes. This image simultaneously exaggerated black men's masculinity and denied their humanity. On the other hand, white men's monopoly on intelligence made them seem not only quintessentially human, but also the best fit for powerful roles. While rejecting the purported sexual superiority of black men, Cleaver acquiesced in the reorientation of the civil rights struggle to the realm of image. He concluded that black men, unable to determine their own self-image through regular social intercourse and development, were in the midst of an identity crisis, the only solution for which was to bring the myths out into the open. Although he was right to detect the ways in which racial myths bolstered existing social relations, his solution indicated how far away the discussion had moved from ways to address the social conditions blacks faced on account of racism. The way to thaw the frozen soul, in the end, seemed to be through personal self-analysis aimed at enhancing one's self-image. What was most limited about this increasingly widespread view was the way in which identity, reconfigured in the end to mean self-image, became the crucial terrain of struggle. Both blacks and whites, in this new ethos, were in the midst of an identity crisis. Black self-depreciation, despair, and even self-hatred resulting from American social conditions were certainly crucial subjects, but the lack of ideas for addressing those conditions obscured the real connection between the psychological and the material, and focused attention on the effect and not on the structures of racial stratification. One of the most virulent anti-white, but also strangely anti-black, documents in this debate referred to black liberation as a distinctly psychological enterprise. For the authors of We Want Black Power, a leaflet published by the Chicago office of SNCC in 1967, regaining control over blackness was essential for psychic stability. Quote, "We have got to begin to say and understand with complete assuredness what black is. Black is an inner pride that the white man's language hampers us from expressing. Black is being a complete fanatic who white society considers insane." Like Mailer's psychopath, the person in touch with his or her deepest inner feelings, however wild and irrational, was judged the most vital. Yet, for these SNCC activists, being black was not enough to establish this identity. The bourgeois Negro, who has been force-fed the white man's propaganda, cannot think for himself, because he is a shell of a man full of contradictions he cannot resolve. He is not to be trusted under any circumstances until he has proved himself to be cured. Turning Mailer's phrase on its head, the document cast these white Negroes as Uncle Toms. These traitors' black skin is a lie, and their guilt the shame of all black men. We must ostracize them, and if necessary exterminate them. Whites, too, clearly had no part in the movement, for as the document went on, we must fill ourselves with hate for all white things. This document, to say the least, represented a complete reversal of the early interracial vision of SNCC and the social, political, and economic goals of the civil rights movement more generally. Then NAACP went further and called it anti-white propaganda. Quote, "It is a reverse Mississippi, a reverse Hitler, a reverse Ku Klux Klan. It is the wicked fanaticism which has swelled our tears, broken our bodies, squeezed our hearts, and taken the blood of our black and white loved ones. It shall not now poison our forward march." In some ways, though, the document is connected to certain whites' romanticization of blacks. The Conference for a New Politics in 1967, for instance, epitomized the tendency among liberals and radicals to romanticize any black voice as the authentic representation of all black people, possessing inherent legitimacy. The conference was characterized by the capitulation of whites and liberals to even the most outrageous and unfair demands of the most extreme black separatist groups in attendance. An editorial in The Crisis explained that certain masochistic liberals have sought to placate the angry voices by endorsing whatever outlandish proposals they advance, including hate whitey slogans and archaic segregation nostrums. Even Charles Hamilton, co-author of Black Power, which threatened Americans with violent retaliation if they did not accept the tract's principles, called for a black-white rapprochement based on mutual self-interest, not from the feelings of guilt and altruism that were evident at the National Conference of New Politics Convention in Chicago in August. Interestingly, the Black Panthers also attacked SNCC's attitude toward whites. Even though the Panthers were an all-black organization, they accepted the assistance of anyone who believed in their programs, as long as there were no strings attached. Since the Panthers' aim was a socialist revolution, anyone willing to participate in an overthrow of the oppressor simply by resisting, not by belonging or participating, was welcome. The Panthers faulted SNCC for fearing whites and for failing to differentiate between liberal whites and white revolutionaries who accept our program in full. "We are the real slaves," Huey Newton said. "Therefore, we should decide what measures and what tools and what programs to use to become liberated. Many of the young white revolutionaries realize this, and I see no reason not to have a coalition with them." True to the dictates of the ritual of white submission and black assertion, Newton allowed whites to participate on an inferior basis, since they lacked the authenticity of the truly oppressed, the real slaves. Huey Newton criticized SNCC and other cultural nationalists for focusing on identity as though that could bring freedom. "Culture itself will not liberate us. We're going to need some stronger stuff." Yet his own posturing and undisciplined antics betrayed an affinity for exactly the cultural politics he decried. The Panthers' critique, though compelling in some ways, indicates the way in which notions of strengthening black culture had devolved into a search for a rather shallow identity, one based on self-defensive claims of authenticity and on image. Culture itself, in fact, was defined here in the narrowest possible sense as the projection of ethnic pride. Newton himself failed to see the contradiction between his critical view of a politics based on a stagnant notion of identity and his own embrace of the idea that the black struggle necessitated hyperbolic images of black male potency. If the guerrilla was both the ideal man and the ideal weapon, as he argued, then the war would be fought largely on the terrain of the mass media. Thus, in translation from theory to practice, the Panthers, like the black Muslim leader Malcolm X, became symbols of the assertion of blackness, of identity unleashed, for some whites as well as blacks, even while they deviated in some ways from the growing consensus on the importance of identity politics. Tom Wolfe's Radical Chic and Mau Mauing the Flatcatchers captured in absurd detail the logical consequence of the encounter between whites' attraction to the cult of authenticity and blacks' assertions of it. The fundraising party for the Black Panthers presented a vivid portrait of the complex of white guilt, desire for belonging, and vicarious experience of an unfettered black identity. Wolfe's satire provided unstinting insight into whites' embrace of black militants. Quote, "What a relief it was, socially, in New York, when the leadership seemed to shift from middle class to funky, from A. Philip Randolph, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and James Farmer to Stokely, Rapp, Leroy, and Eldridge. The most riveting moment came when the white partygoers looked on with envy as a Black Panther raised his fist to a black audience member in a fraternal gesture. Quote, through every white cortex rushes the flash about how the world here is divided between those who rate that acknowledgement right on and those who don't." The historian and journalist Kathy Tumber sees a crucial division within the Black Power movement itself. While some adherents urged the seizure of power through the countervailing force of intimidation, violence, and wholesale assertion of racial pride, other, more conservative advocates conceived of Black Power quite differently. Tumber argues that this latter group was exemplified by the sociologist and church leader Nathan Wright Jr., who called for a moral and historical recovery of the economic and social base of black communities. Although he believed that the emphasis should be less on integration than on desegregated self-development in his words, Wright urged blacks not to lose sight of their place in and obligations to the larger community. He asked whether the emphasis upon self-awareness among black Americans might defeat the dynamics of national solidarity, and warned that while black power could bring black strength, it needed to have strict limits and be judged according to its ability to serve the common good. Instead of Wright's theocentric vision of community, Tumber writes, a vision of black power that appealed to black rage and unappeasable white guilt gave rise to the militant politics of racial resentment, of violent rhetoric and menacing postures that set the terms of the language of empowerment that dominated identity politics after the 1960s. The racial dynamics of the civil rights movement in all its phases are too complex to unravel here. Yet what is clear is the degree to which the therapeutic culture came to dominate discussions of issues one might think exempt from categorization as questions of identity and self-expression, justice, equality, decency. The problems faced by the majority of black Americans in the 1960s went beyond the shortcomings of white liberal opinion to involve poverty, community, economic and social organization, the role of the state, and the harsh physical conditions of ghetto life. In the end, though, therapeutic notions overwhelmed the movement to address these problems, subordinating its most promising aspects to its least, and sacrificing its alternative ethos to the one that was fast becoming dominant in American culture. The increasing amount of time and energy devoted to promoting or attacking therapeutic notions of racial identity and psychological motivations sidetracked the movement, distracting it from the serious task of institutional innovation, economic reorganization, community building, and moral rehabilitation. The continuing dominance of therapeutic discourse also goes a long way toward explaining why the issue of white participation in the civil rights movement could evoke heated, protracted discussion over 20 years later. The transition to a therapeutics of race helped sap the best potential of the movement, hijacked many real prospects for change, and allowed the civil rights movement, the largest interracial mass movement in United States history and one of the country's best hopes for democratic regeneration, to falter.